The morning sun peeked through the airport windows as Thomas Wilson checked his watch one last time before boarding. It was 6:45 a.m., and Flight 2437 from Atlanta to San Francisco would be departing in 30 minutes. As the 47-year-old CEO of Next Level Technologies, Thomas had grown used to early morning flights. His company had just closed a major deal with investors, and after 3 days of non-stop meetings, he was looking forward to getting home. Today was different from his usual travel days. Instead of his tailored suit, Thomas wore dark jeans and a simple navy sweater. He had packed light, just his laptop bag and a small carry-on. The gate agent smiled as she scanned his boarding pass. "Have a pleasant flight, sir," she said. Thomas walked down the jet bridge, nodding politely to the flight attendant at the door. "Good morning," he said, showing his boarding pass. "3A by the window." The attendant glanced at his ticket, then at his casual clothes, and pointed toward the front cabin without the usual welcome she'd given to the businessman ahead of him. Thomas noticed the difference but didn't think much of it. He'd learned long ago to choose his battles. The first-class cabin was half full when he arrived. A flight attendant named Patricia was helping an older gentleman store his luggage in the overhead compartment. Thomas settled into his window seat, stowed his bag beneath the seat in front, and pulled out his tablet to review some notes before takeoff. Another passenger, a woman in her 30s wearing a crisp business suit, took the aisle seat next to him. She introduced herself as Beth, a software engineer heading to a conference. They chatted briefly about Silicon Valley traffic before the safety demonstration began. By 7:30 a.m., the plane was cruising at altitude. Thomas had been flying first class for years, a necessity given his schedule of back-to-back meetings across the country. Next Level had grown from a small startup to employing over 800 people in just 8 years. The travel was exhausting, but the comfort of first class made it bearable. "Would you care for a pre-meal beverage?" Patricia asked Beth with a warm smile. Before turning to the passengers across the aisle, Beth ordered sparkling water. When Patricia finished serving the surrounding passengers, Thomas raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said politely. Patricia glanced his way but continued down the aisle without acknowledging him. Thomas frowned slightly but returned to his tablet. Perhaps she hadn't seen him. 10 minutes later, another flight attendant named Robert came through with hot towels, handing them to every first-class passenger, except Thomas. "I think you missed me," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "Oh, sorry about that," Robert replied without making eye contact, tossing a towel onto Thomas's tray table before quickly moving on. Beth noticed the interaction and raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. When breakfast service began 30 minutes later, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The flight attendant served everyone around Thomas, the businessman across the aisle, the couple in front, Beth beside him, but kept passing by his seat as if it were empty. After watching this happen 3 times, Thomas pressed the call button. Patricia approached with visible reluctance. "Yes?" she asked, her tone noticeably cooler than when she'd spoken to other passengers. "I haven't been offered breakfast yet," Thomas explained calmly. "I confirmed my meal choice during check-in." Patricia's lips tightened. "We've run out of first-class meals," she said curtly, "but I can bring you something from economy if you're that hungry." Beth looked up from her omelet, clearly surprised by the attendant's tone. Thomas blinked, taken aback by the response. "That's strange," he replied evenly. "I pre-ordered my meal when I booked this flight 2 weeks ago, and I noticed that other passengers who boarded after me received their meals." "Sir, we can only serve what we have," Patricia said, louder now so that nearby passengers could hear. "If you'd like an economy meal, I can get one. Otherwise, there's nothing I can do." Thomas maintained his composure, though his heart was beating faster. He'd faced moments like this throughout his career, moments where he had to decide whether to speak up or let it go. As a black executive in the tech industry, he'd learned to pick his battles carefully. "Could I speak with the lead flight attendant, please?" he asked. Robert appeared at Patricia's side, arms crossed. "Is there a problem here?" "I'm just trying to understand why I haven't been served breakfast when everyone else in first class has," Thomas explained. "I was told you've run out, but I pre-ordered my meal and confirmed it at check-in." Sir, we're going to need you to lower your voice, Robert said, despite the fact that Thomas had been speaking quietly. You're disturbing other passengers, Beth interrupted. He's not being loud at all. I'm sitting right next to him. Robert ignored her. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we'll have to take further action. The threat hung in the air. Thomas looked around and noticed several passengers watching the interaction. An older woman across the aisle was frowning deeply at the flight attendants. A man, 2 rows up, had turned completely around in his seat, not bothering to hide the fact that he was recording the interaction on his phone. Thomas took a deep breath. Making a scene wouldn't help anyone. After 20 years in business, he knew when to press an issue and when to address it through proper channels. I understand, he said finally. No meal then. As the flight attendants walked away, Beth leaned over. That was completely inappropriate, she whispered. I've never seen anything like that in first class. Thomas gave her a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. Unfortunately, I have. He pulled out his phone, opened his notes app, and began documenting the interaction, names, times, and exactly what was said. This wasn't about a missed meal anymore. This was about accountability. For the next hour, Thomas tried to focus on his work, but the sting of being singled out wouldn't fade. He kept thinking about the other passengers who had witnessed what happened. Had they noticed? Did they care? Or was this just another invisible moment that people like him experienced while others remained unaware? Across the aisle sat Dr. Lily Chen, a sociology professor returning from an academic conference. She had watched the entire interaction with growing concern. As a researcher who studied workplace discrimination, she recognized the pattern immediately. The polite dismissals, the raised voices when there had been none, the threats of further action for simply asking a question. Lily had been taking notes on her phone about a lecture she'd attended, but now she opened a new document. Time: 8:17 a.m. Description of incident. Names of flight attendants involved. She typed quickly, documenting everything she'd witnessed. 20 years of research had taught her the importance of contemporaneous notes. 2 rows behind Thomas, a retired judge named Richard Torres had also noticed the exchange. He'd seen thousands of witnesses in his courtroom over the years and had developed a sharp eye for body language. The flight attendants' postures when speaking to Thomas, arms crossed, bodies angled away, told him everything he needed to know about their attitude. Thomas kept his eyes on his tablet, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was keenly aware of Patricia and Robert whispering near the galley, occasionally glancing his way. He'd faced this kind of treatment before, at high-end restaurants, in luxury car dealerships, even in the lobby of his own company when he wasn't wearing a suit. The assumptions people made about who belonged where never ceased to frustrate him. Beth, still sitting beside Thomas, broke the uncomfortable silence. That was completely unprofessional, she said quietly. I fly this route twice a month and I've never seen anything like that. Thomas gave her a small, tired smile. It happens more than you might think. Well, it shouldn't, Beth replied firmly. She took out her phone and began typing. I'm sending feedback to customer service right now. Throughout the cabin, other passengers had noticed the incident. An older woman named Diane kept glancing from Thomas to the flight attendants with a deep frown. A young man with headphones had removed them during the exchange and hadn't put them back on, as if staying alert to what might happen next. When Thomas pressed his call button to ask for water, 10 minutes passed before anyone responded. Robert finally approached, holding a small plastic cup half filled with water, which he placed on Thomas's tray without a word. Could I also get the names of the crew working in first class today? Thomas asked evenly. Robert stiffened. Why would you need that information, sir? I'd like to provide feedback about my experience, Thomas replied. His voice remained calm, but his eyes held steady contact. Patricia is the purser. I'm Robert. The other flight attendants in economy are not relevant to your concerns, Robert answered, his tone clipped. He turned and walked away before Thomas could respond. Thomas added the names to his notes. 20 years building a technology company had taught him the value of thorough documentation. As he typed, he heard Lily's voice from across the aisle. "Excuse me," she called to Robert, who had just passed her seat without offering a beverage refill. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier. Did you say you ran out of first-class meals?" Robert paused. "That's correct, ma'am." "That's interesting," Lily continued pleasantly, "because I specifically heard a flight attendant tell another passenger that there were exactly the right number of meals for everyone in first class. That was about 20 minutes before this. Gentleman was told there were none left." Robert's face reddened slightly. "I'm not sure what you heard, but we can only serve what we have available." "I understand." Lily nodded, her phone still in her hand. "And you're Robert, correct? Could you spell your last name for me?" "I'm not required to provide that information," he said sharply before walking away. Lily caught Thomas's eye and gave him a small nod. He nodded back, grateful for the silent support. The flight continued with a tense atmosphere in the first-class cabin. When Patricia came through to collect trash, she spoke warmly to each passenger but passed Thomas's seat without a word. When she reached Beth, Thomas's seatmate spoke up. "Excuse me, but you missed picking up his cup," Beth said, pointing to Thomas's empty water cup. "We'll get it later," Patricia replied without looking at Thomas. "That's fine," Thomas said, placing the cup on his tray. "I'll just hold on to it." As the flight progressed, Thomas noticed more and more passengers watching the crew's interactions with him. Richard Torres, the retired judge, had moved to an empty seat closer to the front where he could observe more clearly. He appeared to be taking notes of his own. A young woman named Kelly, seated in the last row of first class, had been recording parts of the flight on her phone for a travel vlog. Now she angled her camera subtly to capture the service patterns. She wasn't obvious about it, but Thomas noticed her adjusting her position whenever Patricia or Robert approached his row. 2 hours into the flight, Thomas stood to stretch his legs and use the restroom. As he walked to the front of the cabin, he heard Robert say to Patricia in a voice just loud enough to be overheard, "Some people just don't know their place." Thomas paused briefly, then continued walking. Inside the small bathroom, he looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath. The comment stung, but it also strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. When he returned to his seat, he found a business card placed carefully on top of his tablet. It was Lily Chen's, Professor of Sociology, Stanford University. On the back, she had written, "Happy to share my observations if needed." Thomas tucked the card into his wallet. The flight still had 3 hours to go, but he was already thinking about what would happen once they landed. He opened his email and composed a brief message to his executive assistant. "Jennifer, please connect with legal when you get this. I'll need contact information for the airline's corporate headquarters and their chief diversity officer. I'll explain when I land. Also, please reschedule my afternoon meetings. This may take some time." He pressed send, then leaned back in his seat. Across the aisle, Lily gave him an encouraging smile. 2 rows up, Richard Torres was watching the crew with the careful eye of a man who had presided over countless discrimination cases. Behind him, Kelly adjusted her phone once more as Patricia deliberately skipped Thomas during the mid-flight beverage service. Thomas closed his eyes. It was going to be a long flight, but he was far from alone. The plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport just after 10 a.m. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Thomas noticed Robert whispering urgently to Patricia at the front of the cabin. They kept glancing his way, their expressions tense. Thomas remained in his seat as other passengers began gathering their belongings, noting how Patricia was suddenly all smiles with everyone else. "Good luck," Beth whispered as she stood to retrieve her carry-on. She handed Thomas a business card. "I'm in town all week if you need another witness." Thomas thanked her with a nod. Across the aisle, Lily Chen was gathering her papers, careful to place her notes about the flight in a separate folder. Behind them, Richard Torres stood patiently, his eyes still trained on the flight crew. As the cabin emptied, Thomas finally rose and collected his bag. He was in no rush. At the door, Patricia and Robert stood with fixed smiles, thanking each departing passenger. When Thomas approached, both flight attendants looked straight ahead, saying nothing. "Thank you for the flight," Thomas said pointedly, pausing in front of them. Patricia's smile tightened. Robert didn't acknowledge him at all. In the jet bridge, Thomas was surprised to find a man in a crisp airline uniform waiting. His name tag read Michael Davidson, station manager. His expression was serious. "Mr. Wilson?" he asked, stepping forward. "I understand there may have been an issue on your flight today. Could you follow me, please?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "How did you know my name?" Michael looked uncomfortable. "We received a report from the cabin crew about a difficult passenger in seat 3A. They radioed ahead." "I see," Thomas said evenly. "And what exactly did they report?" "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this somewhere private," Michael suggested, gesturing toward the terminal. "I'm happy to talk," Thomas replied, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out his business card and handed it to Michael. "Thomas Wilson, CEO of Next Level Technologies." Michael's eyes widened slightly as he read the card. "Mr. Wilson, I apologize for the confusion. If you'll follow me, we have a lounge where we can speak more comfortably." As they walked through the terminal, Thomas spotted Lily Chen waiting near the gate. She approached them quickly. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Thomas. "I wanted to make sure you got my contact information. I documented everything I observed during the flight." She glanced at Michael. The discriminatory service pattern was quite blatant. Michael's expression grew more concerned. "Ma'am, could I ask your name?" "Dr. Lily Chen, professor of sociology at Stanford. I specialize in workplace discrimination research." She handed him her card as well. "I'd be happy to provide my observations for your investigation." "Investigation?" Michael repeated. "I assume there will be one," Lily said firmly. Before Michael could respond, Richard Torres approached their small group. The retired judge introduced himself and offered his own observations. "In my 30 years on the bench, I've heard many discrimination cases. What I witnessed today was textbook disparate treatment." A younger woman, Kelly, the travel vlogger, joined them next. "I have video," she said simply, holding up her phone. "I was recording for my travel channel and caught several incidents." Michael looked increasingly distressed as two more passengers approached, all offering similar accounts of what they'd witnessed. He quickly ushered everyone to a private airline lounge nearby, away from the busy terminal. Inside, Thomas finally spoke. "I didn't ask these people to come forward," he told Michael quietly. "They chose to." Michael nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. This is not what I was led to expect based on the crew's report." "What exactly did they tell you?" Thomas asked. Michael hesitated. "They reported an unruly passenger who refused to accept that they had run out of meals and was making demands throughout the flight." A soft murmur of disbelief ran through the gathered passengers. "That's completely false," Beth said. "They served everyone in first class except him." "I counted the meal services," Richard added. "Every passenger received a meal except Mr. Wilson." Michael ran a hand over his face. "I need to make some calls. Mr. Wilson, would you be willing to wait? Our regional director is on his way." Thomas checked his watch. "I'll wait." While Michael stepped away to make his calls, the passengers compared notes. Kelly showed clips from her videos, subtle but clear evidence of Thomas being repeatedly skipped during service. Lily shared her detailed timeline of events. Richard offered his perspective on the legal implications. "You don't seem surprised by any of this," Lily said quietly to Thomas. Thomas gave a small shrug. "It's not my first time dealing with assumptions about where I belong." "But you're a CEO," Kelly said, frowning. "That doesn't matter when people make judgments based on what they see," Thomas replied. "I'm just grateful you all noticed and spoke up. Many times these things happen with no witnesses willing to come forward." 45 minutes later, a tall woman in an impeccable suit entered the lounge. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Grace Harrington, Regional Director for Customer Experience." She extended her hand. I came as soon as I heard. I've reviewed the preliminary reports and spoken with our station manager. Thomas shook her hand firmly. I appreciate you coming personally. Grace looked at the group of passengers who had stayed to support Thomas. And I understand all of you witnessed the situation? They nodded. First, let me apologize on behalf of the airline, Grace said, turning back to Thomas. What you experienced is completely unacceptable and against everything our company stands for. I appreciate that, Thomas replied. But I'm more interested in what happens next. Grace straightened her shoulders. A full investigation will begin immediately. We'll review all available evidence, including the statements from these witnesses and any onboard camera footage. The crew members involved have been removed from service pending the investigation. Removed from service? Beth asked. They will not be flying until this matter is resolved, Grace clarified. Mr. Wilson, I've also arranged for our legal team and diversity officer to contact you directly. We take these matters extremely seriously. Thomas nodded slowly. Good, because this isn't just about a missed meal or poor service. This is about people being treated differently based on assumptions and biases. I understand, Grace said solemnly. And I want you to know that whatever the investigation finds, there will be accountability. As the meeting concluded, the passengers exchanged contact information. What had begun as a routine flight had turned into something none of them had expected. They had arrived as strangers but were now united by what they had witnessed and their decision to speak up. Outside the lounge, as the group prepared to go their separate ways, Lily touched Thomas's arm lightly. You know, in my research, I've found that most incidents like this never come to light because people either don't recognize what's happening or choose not to get involved. Thomas smiled, a genuine smile this time. Then I'm fortunate it happened on a flight with people who both recognized it and chose differently. As Thomas finally headed toward the exit, his phone buzzed with an email from his assistant, confirming she had reached the airline's corporate headquarters. The next phase was beginning. What had started with a denied meal would end with accountability, not just for. Thomas woke early the next morning in his San Francisco apartment. After the events of the previous day, he'd canceled his afternoon meetings to give his full statement to the airline's investigation team. Now, as he sipped his coffee and watched the sunrise over the bay, his phone rang. It was Grace Harrington, the airline's regional director. Mr. Wilson? I hope I'm not calling too early, she said. Not at all, Thomas replied. I've been up for hours. I wanted to update you personally. We've launched a full investigation as promised. Our team worked through the night reviewing the initial evidence, and I wanted you to hear this directly. From me. What happened on that flight was completely unacceptable. Thomas took a deep breath. I appreciate your candor. The investigation will be thorough, Grace continued. We've already interviewed 5 passengers who came forward, reviewed the crew's service records, and examined the cabin footage. There's cabin footage? Thomas asked, surprised. Yes, for security purposes. We're pulling all of it from your flight, Grace explained. Our team is also checking the meal inventory records to verify whether there was actually a shortage as claimed. Thomas nodded to himself. And the crew members involved? They've been called in for interviews today. They're currently suspended with pay while we investigate, Grace said. Our CEO has been briefed as well. He'd like to speak with you when you're available. After finishing the call, Thomas stared out at the city skyline. Part of him had expected the airline to downplay the incident or offer some token compensation to make it go away. Their serious response was both surprising and encouraging. Later that morning, Thomas received an email from Dr. Lily Chen containing her full statement to the airline investigators. She had meticulously documented the timeline of events, noting, at 7:35 a.m., flight attendant Patricia served beverages to seats 2A, 2C, 2D, and 2F. Then 3C, Ms. Reynolds, skipped 3A, Mr. Wilson, entirely, and continued with 3D and 3F. This pattern, repeated with the hot towel service at 7:46 a.m. and meal service at 8:05 a.m. Her clinical, detailed observations would be difficult to dispute. Similar statements had come in from the other passengers. Richard Torres's statement included his legal opinion about the clear pattern of discriminatory service, while Kelly had provided time-stamped video clips showing Thomas being repeatedly skipped during service. By afternoon, Thomas received another call, this time from Jennifer, his executive assistant. "Thomas, I have the airline's Chief Diversity Officer, Anthony Parker, on the line. He's requesting a meeting with you tomorrow morning. Also, their legal team sent over some documents they'd like you to review." Thomas agreed to the meeting. "Any other messages?" "Yes, actually. A reporter from the Business Journal called. Someone from the flight must have tipped them off. They're asking for a comment about an incident of discriminatory service on your flight yesterday." Thomas frowned. He hadn't planned on taking this to the media. "Tell them I have no comment at this time. This matter is being handled directly with the airline." Meanwhile, across the city at airline headquarters, the investigation was expanding rapidly. A team of 5 people sat in a conference room reviewing security footage from the flight. The black and white video clearly showed Patricia and Robert systematically skipping Thomas during each service round, while attending to every other passenger in first class. "Check the galley footage again," said Anthony Parker, the diversity officer. "I want to see if there's any interaction between crew members we should be aware of." The team fast-forwarded to a moment when Patricia and Robert were alone in the galley. There was no audio, but their body language, the eye rolling, the dismissive gestures when looking toward Thomas's seat, told a clear story. "Now pull up the inventory records," Anthony instructed. "Let's verify the meal count." A woman named Priya from the catering department scrolled through a spreadsheet. "The manifest shows 12 first-class meals loaded for 11 passengers. There was actually an extra meal, not a shortage." Anthony made a note. "And what about the crew's service records? Any previous complaints?" Another team member, Luis from HR, cleared his throat. "This is where it gets concerning. We found 3 previous passenger complaints about Patricia and Robert over the past year, all from passengers of color in premium cabins. Each was handled individually by different managers, so the pattern wasn't flagged." Anthony sat back in his chair, his expression grave. "So this wasn't an isolated incident?" "There's more," Luis continued. "We've interviewed 2 other crew members who worked with them frequently. Both reported hearing Patricia make comments about passengers not looking like they belong in first class on multiple occasions. Neither reported it at the time." "Why not?" Anthony asked. "They said they were uncomfortable speaking up against a purser. One was still on probation and feared retaliation. As the day progressed, the investigation uncovered more troubling details. Text messages between Patricia and Robert retrieved from company phones showed they had decided before the flight even departed that Thomas didn't look like he could afford first class and had probably used points to upgrade. By late afternoon, Anthony had compiled enough evidence to present to the CEO. The pattern was clear and undeniable. While this was happening, Thomas had his own team working as well. His company's legal counsel had reviewed his documentation and the statements from other passengers. They'd also researched similar incidents reported by other travelers on social media. "It's not just about you, Thomas," his lawyer explained during their call. "This appears to be a systemic issue that the airline needs to address. How do you want to proceed?" Thomas thought about it carefully. "I don't want money. I don't want free flights. I want real change." The next morning, Thomas arrived at airline headquarters for his meeting with Anthony Parker. To his surprise, the airline's CEO, David Reynolds, was also present. "Mr. Wilson," David said, extending his hand, "I want to personally apologize for your experience on our airline." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, but I'm more interested in what you plan to do about it. That's why we're here," Anthony explained, opening a folder. "We've completed the preliminary investigation and the findings are unambiguous. There was a clear pattern of discriminatory service." David nodded solemnly. "The evidence is overwhelming, and frankly disturbing. The meal shortage was fabricated. The claim that you were being disruptive was false. The crew deliberately provided substandard service based on assumptions they made about you." What happens now? Thomas asked. First, accountability, David said firmly. The crew members involved have been terminated, effective immediately. Their behavior violated our zero-tolerance discrimination policy, Anthony continued. But we recognize this isn't just about individual employees. We've identified gaps in our training, reporting, and accountability systems that allowed these incidents to occur without being flagged. We're implementing immediate changes, David added. Enhanced bias training for all customer-facing staff, a new reporting system for discrimination complaints, and a review of how previous complaints were handled. Thomas listened carefully. That's a start. But how will you measure whether these changes are effective? Anthony smiled slightly. That's exactly the right question. We've actually developed a proposal we'd like to discuss with you. He slid a document across the table. It outlined a comprehensive plan for accountability metrics, anonymous testing, and regular review of service quality data, specifically focused on potential bias. We'd like your input on this, Anthony explained. And if you're willing, we'd like to invite you to join a new advisory board we're forming to address these issues long-term. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You want me to help fix your company's discrimination problem? David leaned forward. Mr. Wilson, what happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. We can apologize, we can fire people, we can pay settlements, but none of that creates lasting change. We need people with your experience and perspective to help us build something better. Thomas looked at the proposal again. It wasn't what he had expected. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps a settlement offer with a confidentiality agreement. Instead, they were acknowledging the problem openly and asking for his help to address it. I'll consider it, he said finally. But I'll need to see concrete actions first, not just promises. David nodded. Fair enough. In the meantime, we'd like to share our findings with the other passengers who came forward. Their willingness to speak up made this investigation possible. As Thomas left the building, he felt cautiously optimistic. Real change rarely happened overnight, and there was still much work to be done. But accountability was a crucial first step, one that too often never happened at all. 1 week after the flight, Thomas sat in his office overlooking San Francisco Bay. The morning sun reflected off the water, casting golden light across his desk where a press release from the airline lay open. The headline read, Major Airline announces zero-tolerance policy enforcement and new diversity initiatives. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily Chen. Have you seen the news? Thomas smiled slightly. He and Lily had stayed in touch since the flight, comparing notes as the investigation unfolded. She had become an unexpected ally in this journey. Just reading it now, he replied. The airline had gone public with their findings and actions. The press release stated clearly that an investigation had confirmed discriminatory treatment of a passenger and that the entire crew involved has been terminated for violation of the company's zero-tolerance discrimination policy. While no names were mentioned, the story had quickly spread throughout the industry. Thomas had received calls from several business publications wanting his comment, but he had declined most interviews. This wasn't about publicity for him. There was a knock at his office door, and Jennifer, his executive assistant, stepped in. The airline CEO is on line 1, she said, and that reporter from Business Travel Monthly is still hoping you'll reconsider giving a statement. Thomas nodded. Tell the reporter I'll call back this afternoon. I'll take the CEO's call now. He picked up the phone. Thomas Wilson. Mr. Wilson, it's David Reynolds, the airline CEO began. I wanted to update you personally before our announcement goes public this afternoon. I appreciate that, Thomas replied, leaning back in his chair. The board has approved all the changes we discussed, David continued. Enhanced bias training for all staff, revised complaint procedures, and the new customer service evaluation metrics. We're also establishing the diversity advisory board we talked about, if you're still willing to participate. Thomas had been considering the offer carefully over the past week. I'm interested, but I still have some questions about implementation. Of course, David said. We've scheduled a meeting next week with our diversity team to discuss exactly that. We want to ensure these aren't just temporary fixes but permanent improvements to our company culture. After ending the call, Thomas walked to the window and looked out at the city. The last week had been a whirlwind. What began as a denied meal on a flight had evolved into something much larger, with implications that extended far beyond one incident or one airline. Later that day, Thomas met Beth for coffee. She had reached out after seeing the airline's initial statement. "I still can't believe they fired the entire crew," she said, stirring her latte. "I thought maybe they'd get a warning or something." Thomas shook his head. "According to what I heard, the investigation found this wasn't their first offense. The text they exchanged made it clear this was deliberate discrimination, not just poor service." Beth frowned. "And to think I fly that airline twice a month. I wonder how many times things like this happened and nobody noticed or spoke up." "That's exactly the problem," Thomas replied. "Most of the time, these incidents go unreported or unaddressed. The difference this time was that so many witnesses came forward." "Well, how could we not?" Beth said. "It was so obvious what was happening." Thomas gave her a small smile. "You'd be surprised how often people see discrimination and either don't recognize it or choose to stay silent." His phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Richard Torres, the retired judge, sharing an article about the airline's announcement. The message simply read, "Justice served. Well done." That evening, Thomas finally agreed to one interview with Business Travel Monthly. The reporter, Priya Sharma, met him in the lobby of his company's building. "Thank you for making time, Mr. Wilson," she began. "Many of our readers are frequent business travelers who were concerned by this incident. What would you like them to know about what happened?" Thomas considered his words carefully. What happened on that flight wasn't just about a meal or poor service. It was about assumptions people make about who belongs in certain spaces. As a Black executive, I've experienced these assumptions throughout my career, but rarely with such clear evidence and witnesses. The airline's response seems unusually thorough, Priya noted. "Were you surprised?" "Initially, yes," Thomas admitted. "Too often, companies respond to discrimination complaints with denials or minimal action. The fact that they conducted a serious investigation and took decisive action is unfortunately the exception rather than the rule." "I understand you've been asked to advise them on future initiatives." Thomas nodded. "I've agreed to join their diversity advisory board, but with conditions. I want to ensure these changes are substantive and lasting, not just public relations moves." "What do you hope will come from all this?" Priya asked. Thomas leaned forward slightly. "I hope other companies are paying attention. Discrimination doesn't always look like someone using slurs or outright refusing service. Sometimes it's more subtle, being skipped repeatedly during meal service, receiving different treatment than others in the same cabin. But subtle doesn't mean less harmful or less real." Over the next month, the story continued to evolve. The airline implemented its promised changes, beginning with mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff. An updated reporting system made it easier for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Anonymous testing was implemented to evaluate service quality across different demographics. Thomas attended his first advisory board meeting, where he was joined by diversity experts, customer experience specialists, and, to his surprise, Lily Chen, who had been invited to provide her expertise in workplace discrimination. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said when he saw her. Lily smiled. "They asked me to join last week. I figured if we're going to change how things work, it might as well start with people who witnessed the problem firsthand." The boardroom filled, with executives and experts all focused on one question: how do we create lasting change? The answers wouldn't come easily, but the conversation was finally happening at the highest levels. 3 months after the incident, Thomas received an unexpected email from Kelly, the travel vlogger who had recorded parts of the flight. She had created a series about travelers' rights and discrimination in the travel industry, which had gone viral with over 2 million views. "Your experience was the starting point," she wrote, "but I've received hundreds of similar stories from viewers. The difference is that most of them never saw any accountability. You've helped start an important conversation." That evening, as Thomas prepared for another business trip, He packed his carry-on with a sense of purpose. Tomorrow he would board another flight in another first-class cabin. The airline would be different, but the mission remained the same, creating spaces where everyone was treated with equal dignity, regardless of assumptions about who they were or where they belonged. As he zipped his bag closed, his phone lit up with a notification. It was an industry news alert. 2 more major airlines had announced new diversity initiatives and updated training programs, citing recent events in the industry as their motivation. Thomas smiled. Sometimes change began with something as simple as a denied meal and people willing to speak up about it. The journey was far from over, but at least it had begun.